Atlanta in late autumn carried a particular weight. The wide streets lined with oak trees were heavy with leaves that had turned a deep rust color, and the air carried the smell of damp soil mixed with the faint sweetness of magnolia that refused to surrender to the cold. Valerie Johnson sat in the middle of her living room, on a chair that seemed too large now, surrounded by silence so thick it almost echoed. The television was off, the clock ticked stubbornly on the wall, and outside a neighbor's dog barked without pause. None of it filled the emptiness. What she remembered most was the sound of the door closing, sharp and final, as Henry walked out with his suitcase in one hand and his phone in the other. At the bottom of the steps, a young woman waited in a bright coat, her hair glossy, her laugh piercing the quiet of the street. That was Melissa, the reason Valerie's life had been turned inside out. The words Henry had thrown at her before leaving still rang in her ears. You are no longer needed, you are no one, you have no value. He did not yell them, he did not even sound angry. He said it casually as though stating a fact like he was describing the weather. Those words cut deeper than any scream could. They echoed now in the hollow of the house they had built together over decades of shared mornings and late-night conversations, raising children and paying off bills, fixing broken faucets and planting roses in the backyard. This home had been her fortress, her place of comfort. Now it felt like the walls had absorbed the insult and were pressing in on her. The photographs on the mantelpiece stared at her with quiet reproach. In one, taken 20 years earlier, Henry had his arm around her shoulders, his smile easy and proud. She looked at that frozen image and felt a stranger staring back at her. Who was that man, and how had he become someone capable of abandoning everything they had built for a fleeting promise of youth and attention? The betrayal was not only in his leaving, it was in the indifference with which he had dismissed her. The evenings were the hardest. Valerie would sit by the window as the sun disappeared behind the tall trees, the sky bleeding into shades of purple and gray, and feel the silence settle heavier with every passing minute. She would sometimes leave the lights off, as if dimness could protect her from the reality that her life had changed forever. She heard neighbors talking outside, couples walking together, families returning from work, and felt herself shrinking deeper into the loneliness. The city was alive, but inside her house everything seemed still, paused, lifeless. Her greatest fear, gnawing at her with every quiet night, was not only losing Henry, it was losing the house. The documents, she knew, were written in such a way that Henry could claim ownership, and now with Melissa pushing him, it was only a matter of time before they tried to drive her out. The thought of leaving these walls terrified her more than she could say. Every corner held memories. The kitchen where she baked pies for her children, the porch where she read books during long summers, the small study where Henry once brought home stacks of files and fell asleep at his desk. To lose this place would be like losing her entire life in one brutal sweep. She tried to distract herself with routine. She taught at the local school, surrounded by children whose laughter and noise filled the classrooms, but even there she felt the weight of her private sorrow. Colleagues offered polite smiles, some whispered, and she knew they pitied her. Pity was worse than silence. Pity reminded her of the public nature of her humiliation, that everyone knew Henry had left her for a woman young enough to be his daughter. She walked home from school with her shoulders hunched, as though she could fold into herself and escape the gaze of others. At night she would make herself tea and sit at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from her. She would imagine him there, laughing as he told her about his day, only to remember that the reality was far colder. He was laughing, yes, but not with her. He was laughing with Melissa, and every imagined sound of that laughter stabbed at her. Sometimes she would go upstairs and touch the wardrobe where his clothes had once hung. The hangers were empty now, save for a few forgotten shirts, and the smell of his cologne had long faded. She would close the door quickly, unwilling to feed the wound further, yet unable to stop herself from returning again and again. It was as if some part of her still needed to confirm that he was truly gone, that the absence was not a nightmare but her new reality. Her nights often ended with her sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet, asking herself the questions that never had answers. Was she really no one? Had the years meant nothing? Was her worth so small that it could be discarded without a second thought? The house creaked in response, as though reminding her that she was not entirely alone, yet even the house seemed uncertain of its future. The threat of losing it pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. By late autumn, Valerie felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the cold wind pushing at her back. She had not yet discovered any path forward, only the haunting suspicion that Henry and Melissa would not stop until they stripped her of everything. Still, beneath the crushing grief and the waves of humiliation, a small ember of defiance flickered. She did not yet know how, but she knew she could not let them take what little remained of her life. That ember glowed faintly in the quiet of her heart as the season edged closer to winter. The weeks that followed confirmed Valerie's worst fears. Letters began arriving in cream-colored envelopes with the name of a law firm printed neatly across the top. Inside, the words were sharp and calculated, informing her that Henry intended to reclaim the property as part of the marital division. The tone was not one of negotiation but of inevitability, as though the decision had already been made and she was merely being informed. Each letter felt like a blow, stripping away the thin layer of calm she tried to maintain. She placed them in a drawer in the kitchen as if shutting them away could lessen their weight, but they burned in her memory regardless. The phone calls followed. At first, it was Henry's attorney, brisk and professional, laying out demands that she should vacate the house voluntarily to avoid a prolonged legal battle. When she hung up without responding, Melissa began to call directly, her voice dripping with false sweetness that barely covered the malice beneath. She would say things like, "It's better for you to let go now, Valerie. You don't belong there anymore." These calls left her shaken, but Valerie refused to answer after the first few. She unplugged the phone at night, choosing silence over harassment, though the quiet of the house remained no less oppressive. In public, the humiliation only deepened. At the grocery store one Saturday morning, Valerie turned down an aisle and found herself face to face with Melissa. She stood there with Henry at her side, their arms linked in a display so deliberate it felt staged. Melissa offered a knowing smile, the kind that said she had already won. Henry avoided Valerie's eyes, pretending to study the shelves, but the smirk on Melissa's face said enough. Valerie left her cart half full and walked out of the store, her heart pounding, her vision blurred. The encounter left her trembling for days. The neighbors began to whisper, or at least that was how it felt. Atlanta had never been a city that hid its gossip well. Friends from church offered sympathetic glances, colleagues at school avoided speaking about her home life, but their silence was just as loud as any words. Valerie sensed that the story of Henry's betrayal and Melissa's presence had traveled further than she had wanted. She hated that her pain had become a spectacle. At night, the fear returned stronger. She would imagine strangers arriving with papers that forced her out, her belongings piled on the lawn while she stood powerless. The thought of leaving the house haunted her dreams. She had built her entire adult life within those walls, and to see it claimed by the man who had discarded her and the woman who mocked her was unbearable. She began to feel cornered, as though the house itself was under siege. Despite the fear, something else began to stir inside her. Each attempt by Henry and Melissa to intimidate her only seemed to press against that ember of defiance buried deep in her chest. She realized she could not live forever in fear of their next move. She was still a teacher, still a woman capable of standing in front of a classroom full of children each day, guiding them through lessons and conflicts. That part of her had not vanished simply because Henry had left. If she could handle 30 restless students, she could handle 2 people bent on her destruction. She began to prepare quietly. She gathered her financial records, photocopied old documents, and placed them in a neat folder. She visited the courthouse downtown to better understand the process she was facing, walking the long hallways with a notebook in hand, jotting down details. She did not yet know what weapon she had to fight back, but she knew knowledge itself was a shield. The act of preparing gave her a small sense of control, enough to push back against the panic that had threatened to drown her. There were still nights when she collapsed onto her bed in tears, the loneliness pressing down until it felt impossible to breathe. But there were also mornings when she stood on her porch, coffee in hand, and told herself that the house was hers in more than name. She had lived every inch of it, polished its floors, painted its walls, carried its history. That had to mean something. She clung to that belief, even as the legal letters piled higher and Melissa's laughter seemed to echo in her ears. The pressure had become unbearable, but within it Valerie found a thread of strength. She did not yet know that the answer to her struggle lay hidden in the past, waiting for her in the form of a letter that would surface when she needed it most. For now she only knew one truth: she would not surrender easily, not to Henry, not to Melissa, not to anyone who tried to erase her life. The house stood around her, and she stood with it, bracing herself for the battle that was drawing nearer each day. The night was heavy with the kind of silence that comes after days of restless tension. Valerie had spent the evening sorting through a pile of papers on her kitchen table, trying to bring some order to the chaos of bills, notices, and letters from Henry's lawyers. The stack seemed endless, each envelope carrying another attempt to push her out of the house. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her hands over her tired eyes, and for the first time in weeks felt the weight of exhaustion sink deep into her bones. She knew she could not keep circling in fear. She needed to search for something, anything, that might give her an edge in the fight she was facing. Her mind drifted to the attic, a space she rarely visited anymore. The old cedar chest up there had been untouched for years, a place where family mementos had gathered dust through decades of life. Valerie remembered putting away photo albums, letters, and the keepsakes that belonged to Henry's mother, Eleanor. At the time she had not thought much of it. Now, in the midst of her desperation, she felt an inexplicable pull to that chest. Maybe she hoped to find a document, a deed, some forgotten piece of evidence that could anchor her claim to the house. She climbed the narrow stairs with a flashlight in hand, brushing past cobwebs and boxes stacked in uneven towers. The attic smelled of dry wood and faint mildew, a scent that carried the weight of memory. She pulled the chest into the beam of light and opened it slowly. Inside lay bundles of old letters tied with faded ribbon, postcards yellowed with time, and photo albums with cracked leather covers. Her hands shook slightly as she sifted through them, each object bringing back fragments of her life with Henry's family, moments she thought had been buried forever. Near the bottom of the chest, beneath a quilt folded carefully decades ago, she found an envelope. The handwriting on the front was familiar, though it had been years since she had seen it. Eleanor's careful script spelled her name, Valerie Johnson. Her breath caught. The envelope had never been opened. She hesitated, staring at it as though it might vanish if she blinked. Eleanor had passed several years before, and Valerie had mourned her deeply, for in many ways she had felt closer to her mother-in-law than to Henry himself. They had shared quiet evenings in the kitchen, traded recipes, spoken about books and children and the meaning of loyalty. To hold an unopened letter from her now felt like touching a ghost. She slid her finger under the seal and opened it gently, the paper brittle with age. The words inside were written in the same neat hand, steady despite the passage of time. She began to read, her eyes moving slowly across the lines. My dear Valerie, if you are reading this, it means time has carried me away, but I could not leave without putting these words down. You must know that I always considered you my true family. When my son lost his way, it was you who kept the house alive, who made it warm, who gave it meaning. I cannot trust him to value what should be valued. That is why I want this house to be yours. You deserve it because only you carried love and loyalty within these walls. Remember that I saw you, I recognized you, and I leave this place in your hands with peace in my heart. The letter trembled in her hands as she reached the end. Tears blurred her vision, but she clutched the paper tightly, unwilling to let it slip away. It was not only a blessing, it was a lifeline. Eleanor had named her, acknowledged her, chosen her over her own son. Valerie felt a surge of emotions, grief for the woman she had lost, gratitude for the words that now sustained her, and a rising determination that this letter was the answer she had been searching for. She sat on the attic floor for a long time, letting the words sink in. The letter was more than sentiment, it was testimony. Eleanor had been the matriarch of the family, the original owner of the house. Her voice, even from the past, carried weight. Valerie realized this document could change everything. The lawyers could argue, Henry could posture, Melissa could sneer, but here was a statement of intent, a declaration that the house was hers. It felt as though Eleanor had reached through time to protect her, to shield her from the cruelty of the present. As the night deepened, Valerie carefully placed the letter in a folder with her other documents, but she held it differently than the rest. The bills and notices were weapons of intimidation. This letter was a weapon of truth. She whispered a quiet thank you into the empty attic, unsure if anyone, or anything, could hear but needing to say it all the same. When she descended the stairs, the house felt changed. The walls seemed less like a burden and more like allies, the air lighter, the silence less suffocating. For the first time in months, she slept deeply, the letter tucked safely beside her bed. The following days were still filled with threats and pressure. The phone rang with more demands, another envelope arrived with bold red lettering, Melissa made another appearance at the grocery store. But Valerie no longer trembled. She carried herself differently, aware of the strength in her hands and the truth in her possession. She did not reveal it yet, choosing instead to hold it close, waiting for the right moment. Every evening, she unfolded the letter and read it again, allowing Eleanor's words to wrap around her like armor. She began to imagine the look on Henry's face when the truth was revealed, the shock that would strip away his arrogance. She thought of Melissa too, so certain of her victory, and how fleeting that confidence would soon become. The thought did not bring Valerie cruelty, but it did bring a sense of balance, as though justice was finally within reach. The letter was no longer just paper and ink. It was Eleanor's voice echoing across years, reminding Valerie that she was not alone, that she mattered, that she had been seen. It gave her not only a defense but also a dignity she had nearly lost. And as the date of the trial approached, she knew with certainty that this single piece of paper would alter everything. The day of the hearing arrived with a sharp chill in the Atlanta air. Valerie dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple navy dress and a coat that had belonged to Eleanor years ago, as though carrying a piece of her mother-in-law's presence into the room would give her strength. She tucked the letter into a protective folder and slipped it into her bag, her fingers brushing against it more than once as she prepared to leave. The city's courthouse loomed downtown, its marble steps polished by decades of footsteps, its heavy doors opening to a space that seemed designed to remind people of power and order. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The wooden benches were already filled with people waiting for their cases. Attorneys shuffled papers with the precision of ritual, and the sound of heels clicking against tile echoed across the halls. Valerie sat on a bench outside the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. She was not just fighting for a building of brick and wood. She was fighting for her dignity, her stability, and the years she had invested into a home that had become her sanctuary. When her case was called, she walked into the courtroom with steady steps, refusing to let her nerves betray her. Henry was already seated at the front, his suit immaculate, his tie neatly knotted. Melissa sat beside him, leaning back with that same self-assured smirk Valerie had seen so many times before. They looked like a pair convinced the outcome was already in their favor. Their attorney, a man with silver hair and a polished demeanor, stood as the judge entered, ready to present their case. The arguments began with rehearsed confidence. The lawyer for Henry outlined their claim with precision, speaking of marital property, ownership, and entitlement. He painted a picture of Henry as the rightful heir to the house, suggesting that Valerie's continued presence was little more than an inconvenience. Melissa occasionally nodded as he spoke, her eyes flicking toward Valerie with quiet triumph. Valerie listened without interruption, though her stomach tightened with every word. When her turn came, she rose slowly. She did not have a high-powered attorney with a rehearsed speech. She only had herself, her folder, and the truth that had waited quietly in Eleanor's handwriting. She began by describing her years in the house, the care she had given to it, the role she had played in keeping it alive while Henry drifted away. She spoke calmly, her voice carrying across the room with quiet conviction. The judge listened, expression neutral, pen poised above paper. Then Valerie placed the folder on the table before her and slid out the letter. The envelope was fragile, its paper worn by time, but its contents were unshaken. She explained its origin, how she had discovered it among Eleanor's belongings, how it had remained sealed until recently, and why its words mattered. She handed it to the court clerk, who brought it to the judge. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of paper being unfolded. The judge began to read. His voice filled the room, deliberate and even as Eleanor's words came alive once more. My dear Valerie, you were always my true family. This house should be yours, because only you carried loyalty and love within these walls. The sentences hung in the air, unshakable, undeniable, carrying the authority of a mother who had spoken beyond her own lifetime. Valerie stood still, her hands clasped, as though she could feel Eleanor's presence beside her. The reaction was immediate. Henry's confident posture collapsed into stiffness, his eyes fixed on the letter as though it were a weapon he had never expected. His face lost color, and for once he did not interrupt, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to charm or argue. He sat in stunned silence. Melissa shifted in her seat, her smirk vanishing, replaced by a taut line of unease. Her hand slipped from Henry's arm as though even she realized the ground beneath them had shifted. The judge folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his notes. He did not deliver a verdict in that moment, but the balance of power in the room had already changed. Valerie felt it in the stillness, in the eyes of those watching from the benches, in the silence that pressed down on Henry and Melissa like a weight. She had not shouted, she had not begged, she had simply revealed the truth. And that truth carried more force than all the polished arguments money could buy. As the proceedings continued, Henry's lawyer stumbled through his rebuttal, suddenly stripped of confidence. Without the certainty of ownership, their case faltered. The judge asked questions that forced him to admit the weight of Eleanor's words. Valerie remained calm, her hands steady, her heart beating with a rhythm of quiet victory. When the session ended, the courtroom emptied slowly. Valerie gathered her things, slipping the letter back into her folder. Henry remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, unable to meet her eyes. Melissa whispered something in his ear, but her voice lacked the arrogance it once carried. Valerie did not need to hear what she said, the message was clear enough. Their certainty had shattered. Outside, the sun was bright against the marble steps. Valerie descended slowly, each footfall carrying more weight than the last, but this time it was not fear she carried. It was the strength of knowing she had spoken for herself and been heard. The letter had bridged the gap between the past and the present, giving her the defense she had prayed for. She walked away from the courthouse with her shoulders back and her head high, ready for whatever came next. The days following the hearing felt different, as though the air itself had shifted around Valerie. She carried herself with a quiet strength, not from arrogance but from the relief of knowing she had finally defended what mattered most. The court had not yet delivered the official ruling, but she could see the truth reflected in the silence that had fallen over Henry and Melissa. Their calls stopped, their arrogance evaporated. Where once they had bombarded her with demands, now there was nothing but stillness. For the first time in years she felt like the house was hers not just in practice but in spirit. Neighbors who had witnessed her struggles came by with kind words, slipping notes of encouragement into her mailbox, stopping at the gate to ask how she was doing. For so long she had been invisible, the quiet teacher who lived in the old house, enduring humiliation in silence. Now people looked at her differently. They respected her resilience. She realized she had not only defended her home, she had defended her own worth in a community that now saw her with new eyes. When the letter from the court finally arrived, her hands trembled as she opened it. The decision was clear and concise. The property remained hers, honoring the words of Eleanor's letter and recognizing her years of care. The house she had tended, the garden she had restored, the memories she had preserved, all of it was legally secured as her own. She sat at her kitchen table with the documents spread before her, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. For a moment she wept, not out of sadness but from the release of years of tension that had lived inside her chest. Henry tried once more to confront her. He came to the house unannounced, his car pulling into the driveway like an unwanted reminder of the past. Valerie met him at the porch, standing tall, the ruling letter in her hand. He began to speak, his words faltering between apology and resentment, but she did not allow him to control the moment. She simply held up the document, letting him see the seal of the court and the permanence of what had been decided. His voice broke, and for a moment he looked far older than his years, a man who had gambled on arrogance and lost everything he assumed was his. He turned away without finishing his sentence, retreating to his car and leaving in silence. Melissa did not come back. Whatever bond she and Henry had shared seemed to fracture under the weight of reality. Valerie heard whispers from neighbors that Melissa had moved on, leaving Henry to sit alone in an apartment far smaller than the house he had once tried to claim. Valerie did not rejoice in their downfall, she simply let it be. Some punishments arrive quietly, not with anger but with absence. Life began to take on a new rhythm. Valerie returned to her garden, her hands sinking into the soil as she planted new flowers. The house no longer felt like a battlefield but like a sanctuary again. She hung Eleanor's photograph in the living room, placing it beside the letter now framed under glass. Whenever she looked at it she felt gratitude. Eleanor had seen her not as an outsider but as family, and those words had carried her through the storm. Her students noticed the change as well. She entered the classroom with a brighter energy, her lessons filled with the same warmth but with an added strength that came from surviving trial by fire. She spoke to them about resilience, not as a lecture but as something lived, embodied in the way she carried herself. Some of them, facing their own struggles at home, looked at her with new admiration. She realized her story was not just her own, it was an example that hardship could be faced with dignity. As the seasons turned, the house stood as a testament to survival. Neighbors came by more often, not out of pity but out of genuine companionship. Valerie found herself invited to gatherings, community meetings, and church events. She was no longer just the woman left behind by her husband. She was Valerie, the woman who stood her ground and emerged stronger. One evening, sitting on her porch with the sun setting behind the trees, she thought back to the moment in the courtroom when the judge read Eleanor's letter aloud. She remembered the hush that fell over the room, the way Henry's face drained of color, the way Melissa's confidence cracked. That was the moment the tide had turned, the moment she knew she was not alone. Eleanor had spoken for her from beyond the grave, and those words would live forever in the walls of the house she now proudly called her own. Valerie closed her eyes, breathing in the warm night air. She was not waiting for anyone's approval anymore, not longing for anyone's return. She had herself, her home, her garden, and the memory of a woman who had chosen her as family. And that, she realized, was more than enough. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.